You can work in the same building with someone for years and never really know who they are. That's exactly what happened when a quiet janitor corrected a foreign executive mid-meeting in flawless German. What happened next turned the whole company upside down. But to truly understand why, this story needs to be heard from the beginning. For nearly 2.5 years, Lucia Moreno walked through the marble halls of Callahan and West Corporate Group every weekday. Uniform on, ID clipped, hair tied back, and always carrying that same quiet focus. She wasn't invisible, but she was overlooked. The kind of person people said hello to out of politeness, not curiosity. Lucia's job was straightforward: clean the offices, sanitize the restrooms, refill the paper towels, vacuum the carpets, dust down the boardrooms. Her shift started at 5 a.m., and often she stayed late. She barely ever missed a day. Most people saw her as reliable, respectful, neat, but nothing more. No one knew she held 2 university degrees. No one knew she once worked as a research assistant in a language institute. No one knew she'd lived in 4 countries before the age of 25. Or that she was fluent in 9 languages: English, Spanish, German, French, Mandarin, Japanese, Russian, Portuguese, and Swahili. None of that mattered in her current role, so she didn't talk about it. Until one meeting changed everything. It was a Thursday morning, and one of the biggest international clients, a logistics firm from Berlin, was visiting the office. The whole company had been prepping for the deal for weeks. The executive team had assembled their best. Conference room booked. Translator ready. Presentations loaded. Lucia was refilling the coffee station nearby when she overheard the German client whisper to his assistant. What he said wasn't just rude. It was dismissive. "They look desperate," he muttered in German. "They'll agree to anything. We should cut the offer by 30%. The translator didn't flinch. He wasn't hired to translate side comments. The American team continued, unaware of the insult. But Lucia had paused. She hadn't meant to listen in, but when you know the language, it's hard to unhear words like that. She thought about walking away. She didn't want attention. She didn't want trouble. But something in her couldn't let it go. The disrespect, the arrogance, the assumption that no one else in the room understood. So she turned and walked straight into the boardroom. The room fell quiet. Not confused, just awkward. A janitor walking in mid-meeting wasn't exactly normal. One of the VPs gave a half-smile, trying to wave her off, but Lucia didn't blink. She looked at the German executive and, in perfect high German, said, "Cutting your offer because you believe no one understands your words is a risky business strategy, especially in a global company." You could have heard a pin drop. The client's eyes widened. His assistant glanced down, visibly uncomfortable. The translator blinked, unsure if he'd just been replaced. And the CEO? He stared at Lucia like she'd just spoken in code. Lucia didn't linger. She offered a small nod, turned, and left the room as calmly as she entered. No drama, no emotion, just facts. The CEO stepped out of the meeting less than 5 minutes later, not to scold her, not to ask why she interrupted. He simply wanted to know, who is she? That question opened the door to a story no one had taken the time to hear before. A story about immigration, credentials that didn't transfer across borders, interviews that led nowhere, bills that piled up, and survival jobs taken just to keep the lights on. Lucia hadn't planned to be a janitor. She had applied for dozens of roles: administrative assistant, translator, analyst. She was either overqualified or not a cultural fit, so she took the job she could get. And then she worked in silence. But all along, She carried knowledge that could fill boardrooms. She just needed one moment to speak. What the CEO did next didn't just change her life. It changed the way the entire company viewed talent, diversity, and who really belongs at the table. The door hadn't even closed behind the German executive before CEO Daniel Whitmore turned to his assistant with one question. "Get me everything we have on Lucia Moreno." His voice wasn't raised, but the tone left no room for delay. Within an hour, he was holding a slim employee file. It wasn't much, basic HR data, the kind they collect for contract janitorial staff. Name, contact info, emergency contact, date of hire. No resume, no cover letter, no mention of her linguistic background. "She's a contracted employee, sir," the assistant explained. "We don't hold educational records or previous employment history for support staff. We just confirm work eligibility." Daniel stared at the paper. One page. That's all they knew about the woman who had just upended one of the most delicate negotiations his company had handled this year. He walked down 2 flights to the janitorial supply room himself. Lucia was folding up a fresh stack of microfiber cloths. She looked up, composed, not surprised. "Do you have a moment?" he asked. She nodded. They walked down a quiet hallway into an unused conference room. No preamble, no awkward icebreakers. Daniel sat across from her, leaned forward and said, "That was not a guess. You speak German fluently, don't you?" Lucia nodded once. "Yes, and 8 other languages." He paused. "Can I ask, why are you working here in this role?" Her answer was calm, not defensive. "Because no one hired me in the roles I was qualified for. My degrees are foreign. I've been told my experience didn't align with local standards. And after a while, I needed to pay bills." It wasn't said with bitterness. Just clarity. Truth. Daniel tapped his pen on the desk. "Tell me what your background is." Lucia didn't overstate or dramatize. She laid it out. A bachelor's in linguistics from a university in Chile. A master's in translation and cultural mediation from a university in France. Internships in embassies. Contract work with multinational firms. She had worked on diplomatic teams, written policy documents in multiple languages, and led interpretation teams for international summits. All of that ended when she moved here 5 years ago to care for her father, whose health was declining. By the time he passed, her savings were drained, and her resume had a gap she couldn't fill with local jobs. So, she applied to everything. She adjusted her expectations, and eventually, she applied to the cleaning staff agency that serviced Callahan and West. Daniel sat in silence for a few moments, absorbing it. "Do you want to work here?" he asked finally. "I mean, not as a janitor, in operations, in language services, something that fits what you know." Lucia met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes, I've always wanted to work here, just not the way I ended up doing it." Daniel stood up and shook her hand. "Give me a few days." That conversation didn't stay quiet for long. Word spread. Some employees were shocked. Some embarrassed they'd never really spoken to her beyond quick greetings. A few openly questioned if this was fair. Was she really qualified, or was the CEO just impressed because she embarrassed a client? But the ones who saw her every morning knew the truth. Lucia had always been more than her uniform. It just took one moment for her value to be visible. By Monday morning, Daniel had made a decision. He called in HR, legal, and 2 department heads. They went through company policy, hiring guidelines, conflict of interest rules, then reopened a position in global client relations. The job had been shelved 6 months earlier after they claimed they couldn't find the right person. Now they had someone right under their nose. They asked Lucia to apply. She submitted a full CV. This time it wasn't brushed aside. She was interviewed, formally, twice. And 2 weeks later, she was offered the role. The email went out quietly. Please welcome Lucia Moreno to the Global Client Relations team. Some were confused. Others were curious. A few were downright skeptical. Her first day in the new role wasn't easy. She was no longer invisible. But visibility came with pressure. During her first official meeting, a senior account manager accidentally handed her a coffee order, assuming she was still part of the facilities team. She didn't react. She placed the coffee on the table, then pulled out her laptop and started presenting her strategic plan in fluent Portuguese, based on the next week's client visit from São Paulo. That manager never made the same mistake again. Lucia didn't fight for respect with attitude. She earned it with performance. She was precise, articulate, and always prepared. Within 3 months, she was sitting in on executive-level meetings. Within 6, she led translation protocol for all global client interactions. She drafted negotiation scripts in 4 languages, coached senior executives before international summits. She became the bridge between cultures the company didn't even realize it needed. But what really turned heads was what she did next. She didn't forget where she came from. Lucia quietly asked HR to give her access to the internal job applications submitted by support staff over the last 12 months. She highlighted 3 janitors, 2 security officers, and a mailroom clerk who had applied for entry-level administrative roles but were never called in. One had a degree in finance, another in computer science. One woman had run a logistics company back in Ghana, all overlooked. Lucia walked into Daniel's office and placed the resumes on his desk. "I wasn't the only one," she said. "You just happened to hear me speak." What Daniel did with those resumes is what turned this story into something bigger than one person's success. And that's where everything started to change. For the company and everyone in it. Daniel stared at the stack of resumes Lucia had left on his desk. It was a quiet moment, but not a forgettable one. He knew what she was showing him wasn't just paperwork. It was a blind spot, one that existed right under his leadership. Later that week, during a senior leadership meeting, he held up one of the resumes and asked a single question. How many brilliant people have walked through our doors, only to be handed a mop or a clipboard? The room was silent. He laid out a new directive. Every internal applicant, regardless of department, would receive a review from a hiring manager in the field they applied for. Not an auto-rejection. Not a template email, a real review, and when appropriate, an interview. Not everyone in leadership agreed. Some worried it would flood the system with underqualified applications. Others privately questioned if Daniel was making changes based on emotion rather than merit. But then, something interesting happened. Lucia offered to help review the first batch of candidates. She didn't just scan resumes. She sat with applicants during lunch breaks, asked questions, listened. She wasn't trying to give people shortcuts. She wanted to make sure their skills were properly understood and translated into the language of corporate hiring. One of the janitors she mentored, Adeline from maintenance, had a background in database management. Within 2 months, she was offered a junior IT position. Another, Jamal from night security, had a communications degree and prior experience writing for nonprofit campaigns. He was hired as a marketing assistant. They weren't handed promotions. They were given fair consideration. For some, it changed their lives. She didn't talk about what she was doing on LinkedIn or post long threads online. She still clocked in on time, answered emails with courtesy, and stayed after hours when a project needed polishing. But word about her kept spreading beyond the company. An article ran in a regional business journal. From mop to boardroom, how one multilingual woman is reshaping hiring practices from the inside. It wasn't overly dramatic, but it caught attention. Within weeks, Lucia was invited to speak on a panel at a local university about equitable hiring and workplace diversity, not from an academic standpoint, but from lived experience. She hesitated at first. Public speaking wasn't something she looked for, but Daniel encouraged her. "You're not just representing yourself," he said. "You're reminding companies what talent looks like when it's not packaged the way we expect." Her speech didn't go viral. It didn't break the internet. But it reached the right people. 2 companies reached out to her afterward, asking if she would consult on setting up internal upskilling programs for underrepresented workers. She politely declined. For now, she wanted to stay focused on her work at Callahan and West. But it became clear she had unintentionally become a quiet force of change. Meanwhile, inside the company, the culture was slowly shifting. Supervisors were taking closer looks at internal candidates. Human Resources began offering resume workshops to janitorial and support staff. For the first time, someone from the cleaning crew was promoted into a logistics coordinator role. It wasn't a revolution, it was a ripple effect. And then came the moment that changed everything again. One of the company's biggest European clients requested a language-specific negotiation team for a high-stakes deal in Spain. Normally, they would have outsourced translators or relied on third-party consultants. This time, they asked Lucia to lead it. She assembled a team, fluent speakers, cross-cultural communicators, and internal employees who'd proven themselves in smaller roles. The meeting went flawlessly. No confusion, no miscommunication, no missed tone. The client later sent a personal note to Daniel. "This is the most professionally handled negotiation we've had in years. Whoever trained your team should be training the rest of the industry." Daniel forwarded the message to Lucia with a simple subject line: "You're making history." Her response was short: "I'm just doing the job I was hired for." But by then, everyone in the office knew she was doing more than that. At the annual company awards banquet, Lucia was called to the stage, not for Employee of the Month or a diversity token recognition. She received the company's highest internal honor, the Whitmore Leadership Award, named after the founder's father. In front of 600 employees, she accepted it humbly. No long speech, no big emotional breakdown. She said, "You saw my work. You gave me a chance. I'm here to make sure others get theirs too." And she meant it, because she had no intention of stopping. Not when there were still brilliant people mopping floors in silence, wondering if anyone would ever see what they had to offer. Months passed. Lucia continued her work quietly, steadily, never once acting like she was owed praise for what she had done. Promotions came her way, but they didn't change her. She didn't redecorate her office with expensive art or start taking meetings just to be seen. She focused on results. She built a small but strong internal development program for non-corporate staff. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't designed for headlines. But it worked. Former janitors, cafeteria workers, receptionists, and even part-time drivers were now finding opportunities to be seen, trained, and taken seriously. Some left the company, moving into bigger roles at other firms. Lucia encouraged them. "You don't owe loyalty to a logo. You owe it to your growth." She never asked for credit, but the people she helped never forgot. Daniel often joked that if Lucia ever left, the company would collapse within a week. But he knew deep down, her impact was permanent. She had shifted the way the company looked at people, talent, and leadership. Then, one day, something unexpected happened. A woman in her early 40s showed up in the lobby asking for Lucia. She wasn't dressed like a client. She wore a simple coat and held a worn leather binder. Lucia met her downstairs, curious. The woman introduced herself as Mireille. She was a cleaning supervisor at a different corporate building across town. "I heard about what you've done here," she said, her voice shaking a little. "People talk. Quietly, but they talk." Lucia listened. Mireille explained how she managed a team of janitorial staff with multiple degrees between them: accounting, biology, engineering, and yet none had ever made it past a mop. "I want to do what you did," Mireille said, clutching the binder. "But I don't know where to start." Lucia invited her to sit. For the next 2 hours, they talked. Not as manager and guest, but as two women who had been underestimated most of their lives. Lucia gave her everything: frameworks, documents, templates, and even a direct line of contact if she ever needed help again. When Mireille left, she hugged her. "Thank you," she whispered. "You don't know how many people are waiting for someone like you to show them it's possible." Lucia smiled. "I didn't do this alone. You won't have to either." Word of Mireille's visit spread. Over the next few months, more messages came in. From other cleaning supervisors, from cafeteria managers, from office assistants, some across the city, others from different states. Lucia's quiet movement was now turning into something more. She created a network, not a nonprofit, not a branded campaign, just a shared drive, a mailing list, and a series of meetups where people could talk, plan, and build. She called it the Second Look Initiative. Its motto was simple: potential deserves more than a passing glance. It grew faster than she expected. By the next year, 5 major companies had adopted similar internal training and review systems, using Lucia's structure. Others reached out for help starting their own. She never tried to turn it into a business. She wasn't interested in profit. But one evening, during a quiet moment at her desk, she looked at the whiteboard in her office, filled with names, timelines, and connections, and felt something she hadn't let herself feel in a long time: peace. For the first time in her life, she wasn't fighting to be heard. She wasn't proving her worth. She was building a path, one where others wouldn't have to fight as hard just to be seen. And then came the letter. Handwritten. No return address. It was from a former janitor at Callahan and West, someone who had left after being promoted. Lucia had helped him rewrite his resume, prepare for interviews, and build confidence. His note was short. "Lucia, I'm writing this from my office at my new company. They gave me a team. They gave me a voice. But you were the first person who gave me a chance. I'll never forget that. Because of you, I look at everyone on my team, regardless of title, and ask myself, what don't I see yet? Thank you for changing my life, and thank you for teaching me how to change others, too." Lucia folded the letter and placed it in a small box she kept for keepsakes. Inside that box were a few other things: a photo of her family, a keychain from her first job, and the small, frayed notepad she once used to practice translating between languages at night, when the building was empty. She glanced at her reflection in the window. She didn't see a janitor anymore. She saw a leader, a woman who never raised her voice but still moved mountains, a woman who never sought recognition but became unforgettable. Her story didn't end with a viral post or a best-selling book. It ended with people walking into opportunities they were once shut out of. Doors opening quietly, without drama, because someone finally saw what had been there all along. Lucia Moreno proved that the most powerful change doesn't always arrive loudly. Sometimes, it's a janitor with a mop in one hand and fluency in 9 languages in the other. Sometimes, it's the quiet one, who ends up being the loudest voice of all.